Let's turn to Isaiah 25. By the way, everyone's DID system, or that which is dissociated, is held and governed and articulated from the second heavens. And this is a dimensional separation, not spatial. And as we're going to see that this web that's over the nations, just picture the earth as, of course, a sphere, a globe. And then in the lower atmosphere, Satan's the prince of the power of the air, whereas communication network is in that air, in Ephesians 2:2. Then in a trans-dimensional sense, we have the second heavens where all this is going on. All these dimensions and all that which Satan is using for his control, it was all created by God. He's a thief, and he's come in through the fall of man and gained access to these domains as the ruler and prince of this world. So when someone is severely traumatized and their life essence, and they go into death, and then in that state of death, the enemy literally siphons off neshama. And when that person is resuscitated out of a clinical state of death, they come back with less neshama than they had before they went into death. This is not spatial, but it is dimensional - spiritual. And so these people will share how they were taken from Satan's throne in Jerusalem to go out to various points that would go from Jerusalem to the east. It would lay down what we call ley lines and create a web over that 1040 window, where there are over 50 people groups that are unevangelized, waiting to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's very important to understand that Satan's throne has locality. In Revelation 2:13, in John's time, Satan's throne and dwelling place was in Pergamum. And that whole altar of Pergamum was, of course, taken to Berlin. It was a part of the Third Reich.
Museum, yeah.
And so that was, of course, Nazi Germany, but after World War II, where did Satan move his throne? He moved it to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Always the highest rituals that are now occurring in the world is coming from the Council of Hybrids under the rule of Satan in Jerusalem. This would, of course, be under the Temple Mount and, of course, projected up into the second heavens. Dan remembers being taken there as a little boy and terribly traumatized, thrown into a pit so the enemy could siphon off neshama. And so the enemy has taken that which he has stolen and created a web or a veil over the nations. Remember, if you're trying to conceptualize this in terms of spatial geography, you will not be able to comprehend this. This is a supernatural but real and spiritual realm. In other words, in dimensions beyond our dimension, from our perspective, we could be at two places at the same time. And so that in our dimension, that's impossible, but in higher dimensions, it's not possible. So the second heavens is a multi-dimensional or trans-dimensional domain. So in Isaiah 25, we'll just begin with verse 6. And this, of course, is verse 6 describes the second coming of our Lord, the Messiah, when he brings his bride with him from heaven, and he comes back to, of course, deliver Israel and to establish his 1,000-year reign. He will inaugurate his 1,000-year reign with the wedding supper of the Lamb. So we see in verse 6 this great celebration inaugurating his 1,000-year reign. But before that can happen, verses 7 and 8 must be realized first. So in verse 7 it says, "On this mountain," referring to Mount Zion, or today the Temple Mount, "swallow up the covering which is over all the peoples, even the veil which is stretched over all the nations." The first sentence, all the peoples, I take that first to the Jewish people. And the second line, all nations, refers to the Gentiles. Because this veil, we know from 2 Corinthians 3, is over the hearts of the Jewish people because of their unbelief. So this swallowing up is, of course, the removal and the destruction of this satanic veil or covering. Now, in the actual Hebrew Bible, the face of the covering, which covers all the peoples. And so the word that is used there, lut, is spelled with 3 Hebrew letters. So if you go to a Hebrew lexicon, it will list that same spelling as 3 different roots. And so this is somewhat of a subjective way to try to describe that particular singular Hebrew form. In other words, if you take this particular word, lut, and look at the range of its usage over the Hebrew Bible, and the variety of ways it's used in different contexts, lexicographers would assume that there's 3 separate roots only under the same spelling. However, if you're listening to this read in the Hebrew language, I believe the association that is attributed to this word as separate roots would be fluid and interconnected and interrelated. So in this context, it's translated the face of the veil, which is covering the people. So the face of the veil, which is covering. You see, the cal passive participle. That's how it's written. So here's the point. When you hear this, what are the nuances of what's going on here in this passage? Well, if you look at this term, it means to cover over or to hide or wrap. If you look at this term as it is used in Exodus chapter 7, verse 22 and 8, 3, and 14, it is a term that is used to describe the Egyptian magicians who in rap are using magic to create their desired results. So embedded in this word is the idea of a supernatural power to create a covering or that which wraps. In the Brown Driver, in one lexicon, it means to wrap closely, to tightly enwrap, or to envelop. But in the Exodus text, where the magicians are, the same word uses to describe the magicians there, it's what they're practicing as secrecy or mystery, or their mysteries or enchantments. So as we stand back and look at this, we see that this covering is established through occult powers. And those occult powers create a covering. So there's a clear implication in this first reference here that this is a supernatural, occultic, enveloping power that is operating over the peoples. And I'll be the first reference there would be the Jewish people. Now the second term, which is translated in my Bible, even the veil, which is stretched over the nations. Because of the range of usage in the Bible, the lexicographers create what they refer to as separate roots. So in the first reference of this term, it's nasak. It means to pour out a libation offering. And it's used in various texts for that purpose, like in honor of a god, for example, or to make a covenant. And because the ancients in making covenants were accustomed to offer libations. So in the process, through magical arts, they're intertwining and weaving hedge, or translated a veil here. And so what we see is in this ritual activity, there's a process of a weaving going on, or like a web or a covering that is being put in place around the earth. And so there's also a terminology that was actually used in the making idols. I could spend more time on this, but what we see here in this passage, first, that which represents occult activity involving a ritual activity to create this veil. And so in the second phase, he says, well, even the web which is woven over the nations. In verse 8, he expands that by saying, this veil is associated with spiritual death. In other words, before physical death can be swallowed up for all time, there must first be a removal of this veil of spiritual death. And so when the Lord comes back at the second advent, we're going to see the more and more fulfillment on earth of the swallowing up of death for all time, when, of course, Old Testament saints will be raised, etc. So what we've seen is people become integrated and they gain back their life, and that neshama. We see the heavens being shaken, as Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24. He said, one of the signs of his coming, he says, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And the word powers in the Greek lexicon means armies. I could give you account after account when a person gains back some of their life essence from the second heavens. When those heavens, there's a shaking going on each time. And how do we know that? Because when there's first a shaking in the heavens, there's a shaking on earth. Because the prophet says, I will shake both the heavens and the earth. That's the order. And one example, when we worked with Constantina, of course, Dan was used for this in a similar purpose, that when North Korea was divided, North and South Korea were divided, that whole process of powering up that regime was established through rituals. Dan was involved and Connie was involved. Sally was taken to Tibet with the Tibetan masters in her early life. For 6 months was sodomized daily by different monks in order to siphon off neshama. And so when North Korea was established, and Kim Jong-un, of course, succeeded Kim Il-sung. Well, Kim Il-sung was the first leader, and then the second was Kim Jong-il. So they took Connie there because of her position in the bloodline. And she, as a little girl, she was married to Kim Jong-il. And then later in their life, there was a bringing together of the two of them. to produce the current leader now, Kim Jong-un. Now I know that his mother will not be her, because the mother was a surrogate mother, but the biological had to have a bloodline connection. When we were getting into this event, and that when we broke the marriage bond with Kim Jong-il, strip him of any satanic power that was channeled to Connie, I knew that the heavens were going to shake as a result of that. And so I just waited to see how long it would be before there was a shaking on earth. Within 24 hours, and this was several years ago, for the first time in history, North Korea began to fire off all these missiles and create an international incident, threatening a war and an attack on South Korea, and threatening to attack the United States. So when God says, I'll shake first the heavens and then the earth, by going into this work, that shaking in the heavens is actually hastening the coming day of God. It's that distance between the third heaven and the first heaven is being narrowed and weakened, preparing a way for the Lord. But he descends from the third heaven, and he will catch the church up into the air in the first heaven. It is our task and responsibility in working together with the Lord, clearing the second heavens, and the core aspects of a person's identity who is held captive there, which is preparing the way of the Lord, so he can actually return from the third heaven to the first heaven. Well, I would just add to this that every time when you're working with a multiple, as soon as you release neshama from this captive domain, it's like a chess game. You remove that piece, things have to recalibrate in the second heavens. The enemy sets up a preemptive strategy. So before you get to that next place of captivity, he will do whatever he can to create an access to that individual so you don't get there. And whatever remains dissociated are pieces on that chessboard that he can move around to maintain that web and that covering. And as that veil is being removed, it's making a way for the fullness of the Gentiles to come into the body of Christ. Because Romans 8:11, Jesus cannot return until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. That is, they come into salvation. So if you're serious about hastening the coming day of God, by working with this population, you're actually, like John the Baptist, making a way for the Lord. And on the other side, the complementary side of that, you're also making a way for the church to attain the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, Ephesians 4:13. So the anchor point is the Temple Mount. Satan moved his throne there after World War II Germany to position himself there and remain there until Jesus returns, because he's going to return to Jerusalem. And according to Isaiah 2:1-4, for 1,000 years his throne will be right there on the Temple Mount. And right now that's occupied by Satan and his throne. And so we need to be a part of dethroning him. And so that is a part of the work we're doing with SRADID. We're workers together with the Lord in this. So there's the personal, individual, and relational level, which our brother Franz has mentioned, having a home for people. But also on the higher level, we might say, this is actually preparing the way for the Lord. And this does involve entering in and sharing with Christ and his sufferings. So Dan, I'll just refer to you. You've heard what we just talked about. We have a foundation abuse that, of course, begins in Jerusalem, but then there was a going back and forth to different areas to create this web over the nations. So we reclaimed your life essence from these domains. You begin to be aware of what took place.
There's a book called Back to Jerusalem by Paul Hathaway. In that book, it describes some events in China, the turn of the 1900s, some events that happened in China. Chinese brothers were praying, and God showed them that he had saved what we now call the 1040 window for the church in China to evangelize from China back to Jerusalem. And what the 1040 means is the latitudes and longitudes. You have 10 and 40. If we look at the historical move of Christianity, historically moved from Jerusalem, and it continued to move westward through Germany, Europe, Scotland, and across the United States. From the United States across the Pacific. And if you continue on, you would go up Korea and China and then on back. Then you have this revelation God gave to the Chinese brothers. It was, I think, around 1904. They were in prayer about that, and it wasn't until about 1947, 48, that several teams, 3 teams, I believe, and they did not know about each other, felt that God was calling them to move in that direction to go west. They were actually stopped at the Russian border. They were turned back. They were in prison, and all but one died in prison. So this one man,
Simon Zhao,
he was in prison for, I think, 40 years. He was part of the original group that had that vision that the Lord was moving them back through that window. But it was stopped late 1947, at 48, up to 1949, they were stopped and not able to go on. I'm going to describe something of my early history. What I discovered took a great deal of effort and time for it to come forth. Okay, we're going to say Jerusalem is right here. Most all of us, if not all of us, who have been born into the generational SRA-DAD, God has shown us through this Neshama that we were born in Jerusalem. I mentioned earlier that the positioning for our conception and birth, ritual activity starts even before it. This represents supernatural, spiritual powering up. So that when we're born, it's not just a matter of us, but there is a deposit of demonic activity. So unfortunately, we become something like atomic bombs, and we carry with us a supernatural, spiritual power.
And the key to this power is having a specific bloodline that will, in this case, anchors you back to Nimrod.
Because unfortunately, Satan, he finds power in spiritual sin, in generational sin. And God says he visits the sins of the fathers on the sons to the third and the fourth generation. And you can have multiple generations of sin that passes down. And you have a culmination over and over and over as it continues to pass down. So our birth is not happenstance, but it is very well satanically planned. So Jerusalem's here. My birth was here. What I've uncovered through years of work, that after establishing a base in me and after a new birth experience that was sequestered off, then I began to be taken to areas in the Far East, and in 3-month sequences, so from Jerusalem, Kashi in the northwest of China, ritual activity, back to Jerusalem. Beijing, ritual activity to the Yalu River, the edge of China. Ritual activity, back to Jerusalem. To the 38th parallel, the very dividing point of North and South Korea. So I'm going to stop here for just a second and talk about that. Many of us have been tied together very specifically in this.
You know, like bonded.
I was present at the birth, at a birth which had to do with the ritual murder of the mother and then the taking out of the child. It happened to Jerusalem, and then she and I were both taken to this point, a 38th parallel.
The mother and you. Yeah.
Well, the mother was dead. Infant was taken here.
And
The infant girl was brought here. Supernaturally, I was given responsibility for this child's life. So I'm standing here, I'm facing back toward the east. And there was a ritual activity, and where the child was, I was made responsible, and yet the child was thrown to the ground. I was made responsible for it. The only way I can describe what happened is like there was an explosion inside of me. And then it's like a mushroom cloud came out of me. And this huge spiritual wall came up and out to the south and to the north. The yin and the yang, the dialectic. Are you familiar with that?
Light and dark.
Und Yin
Light in the darkness. The light went to the south in South Korea. The dark went to the north in North Korea. This happened in May of 1950. Now, at the end of World War II, you had the Americans, the Allied forces landed and came up from the south in Korea. The Russian troops came from the north down. And Korea had been occupied by Japan for years. So now you have Russian and American forces that are occupying Korea. Up to this point, it was one country. But the Russians set up a government in the north. The U.S. and the Allied forces set up a government in the south. And the dividing point was right about the 38th parallel. And in June of 1950, the Russian, the Chinese, and North Korean forces invaded South Korea. And of course, this started the Korean conflict. The war went on for several years until there was a stopping at the 38th parallel. There is no ceasefire or end to this day. So you have this tension, the north against the south and the south against the north, right there. The 38th parallel is a no man's land, 3 miles on either side. There's barbed wire and no one except military forces in there. That is the basis of a spiritual wall that came up, and I believe God has made it very clear that we, members of the body of Christ, were used to establish a spiritual wall and is to stop the gospel from going back through that 1040 window. So that was the 38th parallel. After all that happened, it was back to Jerusalem. One more trip back to Fuzhou, I think it was, on the coast of Japan. That happens to be the home and the beginning of Watchman Nee's movement, Little Flock. Okay, we'll be back to Jerusalem, and then the final place is Singapore, where I experienced a drowning in a lake in the middle of Singapore. What God has shown me is this is a foundational basis of a web that was woven over that area to bring in a deceiving spirit over the people and the nations. And it's a blanket of spiritual death. If you look at history, Chiang Kai-shek had his republic in China. The beginning of the time that I started in Kashi, Mao and his Red Army, he began fighting from this area coming down across China. What he did was he drove the Republic army that was left onto Taiwan. China became Red China, communism.
And so what you're saying is that the power of this enemy force had a spiritual energy behind it.
Yeah, unfortunately, in my very own life and what was deposited in me from generational sin.
Yeah, okay. And I would just say that the bloodline of King George VI and the whole history of working with SRA has been the most hidden bloodline and the most powerful when it comes to the very spirit of Apollyon himself. And so there's an interface between this bloodline of what has been called the Collins bloodline, but that's not public because it's Gotha Saxe-Coburg on the. That particular bloodline was interfaced with Adolf Hitler. Hitler's rise came out of an interface with this bloodline. This is not something public you're going to read, but behind the scenes on an occult ritual level.
Well, didn't I read under Mao's rule, more Christians were killed during that period of time than any other history?
More people have died in history under the reign of Mao than any other recorded time. An estimated of about 65 million.
And all the foreign missionaries were expelled from the country.
And so we don't want you to get lost in a lot of the historical details, and that's not Dan's intention. But this web is a real thing, and it's unseen, but it's real and effective.